Okay, so we're going to talk today about the Constitutional Convention. If I can find my notes, which I just had in my hand, and then I moved them. There it is. Okay. All right, so far, the country has been operating under a document called, who knows?
The Articles of Confederation?
Correct, the Articles of Confederation. I think we're going to take notes today. All right. So, if you think it's important, write it down. If I write it on the board, definitely write it down. Okay, the Articles of Confederation. Anybody know what was wrong with the Articles of Confederation? Why were they a problem? Good, I'm glad we're going to talk about it, since nobody knows. First of all, the states make all their own decisions, pretty much. Okay? States remain very independent under the Articles of Confederation. One of the things the states can do is they can tax their own people in their state. But the Articles of Federation don't raise any federal taxes. What does federal mean?
Like, the whole over in charge of everything.
The whole country.
Yeah.
Okay, a central government over the whole country. So federal taxes would come from all of the 13 states, right? Because they're states now. They're no longer colonies. They've won the war for independence, and they are now states. Okay, so the states can raise taxes within their state, but they're not required to give any of that to the federal government, which means the federal government has no money with which to function. All right, so that is a big problem because, first of all, there are debts from the war. We know Washington had terrible problems at Valley Forge. He had no shoes for his men. He had hardly any food for his men, hardly any tents, and it was the winter in Pennsylvania. It was cold, it was snowy, it was awful. And his men were suffering because of it. And he couldn't get any money from Congress because Congress had no way to gain money from the states. There was no, or the colonies at that point, all right? So we won our independence, right, from the British, and now it's like the United States is now kind of a kid who's moved out of their parents' house, right? And now they have to grow up, and they have to figure out how are we going to pay our rent, right? How are we going to buy our food? What are we going to do? There's no real government. There is no financial system at all. And they really don't have any foreign allies yet because we haven't done any foreign relations yet. Okay? We do immediately send two very famous men, off to Europe to work on this. One of them is John Adams, and the other is Thomas Jefferson. John Adams goes to England, Thomas Jefferson goes to France as our representatives, our ambassadors, our diplomats there, okay? So they're not at this. They're not at the Constitutional Convention because we're getting rid of these. These are not helping us. We need a better form of government. So, in Philadelphia, if I write it, you should write it. If you can't see it, you should maybe move over there. In Philadelphia, they call a Constitutional Convention. We need a governing document for a real governing document. All right? So the Continental Congress was doing some things besides declaring independence. They did that. They ran the war for the most part. They organized the peace. They operate a post office. They collect money, but not for the whole country, basically to keep the Congress running. They deal with the Native Americans when the states don't want to deal with them. But again, no taxes, no federal judiciary system, no courts that belong to the federal government, and no power to make the states pay. They can't produce any money. They can't print money, they can't make coinage. So all of these things that they are not able to do at this point. So the states are just constantly squabbling with each other. There's no way that they can kind of come together and come to some agreements. This is why we need this. There were also problems with some agents of states trying to make separate agreements with foreign countries. So like France and Spain and England. In fact, if you've heard of Ethan Allen, he was one of the famous men in the Revolution. He was a war hero. He actually met with some British agents about possibly making his home state of Vermont not part of the United States, but part of a its own British province. They almost put him on trial for treason for it, but we needed a way to have diplomacy not by individual states, but by a national diplomacy. So, two things that the Articles of Confederation did do. They had two, we can talk about all the negatives, okay, but they did do two good things. One was called the Land Ordinance of 1785. You don't need to remember that. But what it did was it gave a way for the federal government to buy and own land that belongs to the federal government. Okay, so that the territory won by the British, okay, it couldn't be claimed by any of the states. Okay, it was claimed by the United States government under this land ordinance, and then they divided it up among the states how they would get their land, and they divided it up in what they called townships. And these townships were all, let me get the measurements, were 1 square mile. So a mile on each side, about 640 acres. And then the federal government would sell these townships at auction. So people could come and buy land from the federal government in their state. All right? So, and that also, the revenue from that established the first public schools in America. Since, some of the colonies had their own schools that any kid could come to, which was technically a public school. But since most colonies were established by one group, right, the Puritans or the Pilgrims, it wasn't truly a public school. But so this allows for public schools to begin to exist in the United States. The second law that was good under the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance. Okay, and what that was said that every new state that entered the country was equal in every way to the original 13 states. They weren't like, okay, well, you're like an afterthought. You're not as important because you're not one of the original 13. It wasn't like that. Any new states would have the same status. The Northwest Ordinance also banned slavery in new territories, which is good, but then that gets changed later and changed all the way through the Civil War. That we don't actually do a lot of banning until we got to get up to the 1860s for that. But they did stabilize the new country, both of the laws, and but now we need to do more than that. So they decide, we're going to Philadelphia, we're meeting together. Guess who was the first person to show up in Philadelphia?
Benjamin Franklin?
That's a good guess because he's from Philadelphia, but no, because he's not there, he's in France. When you think of the Constitution, you should think of the father of the Constitution, the architect of the Constitution.
Thomas Jefferson?
Nope, he's gone too. James Madison. James Madison, y'all. If you ask me who's my favorite founding father, it's James Madison, and his wife is my favorite founding mother, Dolly Madison. Why? Why would I choose James Madison? The architect of the Constitution. Who knows how long our Constitution has been the governing document for our country? Any guesses? Just guess, what?
350 years.
That's a good guess, but that's a little too long.
250 years.
That's closer. 230 years. Our Constitution has been the governing document for our democratic republic. Okay? That means democratic, we all get to vote. Republic, meaning that it's not just our votes. We vote for people in Congress to represent us. So like every person in the United States doesn't vote for every single law. Our representatives do that. Republic means we have a representative government. This is by far the longest democratic constitution in the world. It has been governing our country for well over 200 years now. That is an extreme achievement because almost every other country has changed their documents or their country has disappeared altogether and become a different country. It's really an amazing document that these guys who gathered in Philadelphia came up with. The reason it works so well is it's a document of compromise. Or compromises. What does it mean to compromise? Yes?
To give something up in return for something that you want.
Give a little, take a little, right? The give and the take. That is what our Constitution has a lot of compromises in it. In that, so we have the big states get represented, and so do the small states. Okay, how does that work? Well, we have the Congress, right? There are two houses of Congress. Congress meets in Washington, D.C., right? What are the two houses of Congress?
Senate
Correct?
and House of Representatives.
And the House. That will be on the test, if we have a test. You need to know that. Okay, why is this compromise? For the small states, the Senate, every single state has 2 senators. Every single state. Whether you're teeny tiny Rhode Island or you're giant, let's go by population, most states, we can talk about how big they are. California or New York, huge populations, right? This goes by population. All right, so New York and California have the largest representation. Now Alaska, which is the largest state, has very small representation because it doesn't have very many people. Lots and lots of land, but not very many people. This is based on representation for people. So the big states are very powerful in the House of Representatives because they have a lot of people to represent. But everybody gets 2. You can be a state with a few thousand people in your state, and you still get 2. You can be California or New York with hundreds of millions of people, and you still get 2. So it dilutes the power of the big states, makes it a little less, and it increases the power for the small states, because they get the same number as the big states. Talking about population, not by territory. All right? So got that? That's a compromise. Okay? The other thing it does is it compromises the power of the 3 parts of our government. I know this isn't a political science class, but we still need to know these things. So our government has 3 branches, right? You've heard that before, the branches of the government. Who can name one besides Luke? Can you phone a friend? Who's kind of the one person that's in charge of a bunch of stuff? Who's that? In our country. Who do we have? The one person that, the president, okay? That's called the executive branch. He's kind of like the CEO of the country. Okay, but he has to answer to the stockholders, like any good CEO does. Chairman and chief executive officer. Who makes the laws in our country? Nope, not the judicial branch. Who makes the laws? Just what, we just talked about them.
Or legislative?
Yeah, the Congress, which is the legislative branch, right? Legislative just means laws, okay? So they're the legislative branch, they make the laws. And then the judiciary is the third one. But what is the judiciary made up of? It's judiciary, the same word as judge, same root word. It's the courts, right? Specifically the Supreme Court, of course, but all the courts, all the federal courts.
Is it hot or cold in here?
It's, you guys hot or cold? Pretty regular, yeah, we're fine. It's not cold really, it was cold when we came in, but I think we heated it.
Yeah, it's cold upstairs.
Yeah, no, it's good in here. So the Supreme Court is the judiciary, and then all the courts below it, the federal courts, the appeals courts, and all of those things, all right? So, each of these branches is co-equal. What does that mean? Each one is equal because they each have a power over the other. And what they call it is each one can check the power of the government. How many of you have played chess? You play chess and you take your piece and you put someone in check, right? That means they need to do something or they're going to lose the game in a minute. It's going to be checkmate in a minute, right? So they get to check each other. So, let's see, the judiciary, okay? One of the main things the judiciary, the Supreme Court does is interpret the Constitution. They decide when Congress makes a law, does that law fall in line with the Constitution? Is it constitutional? One of the main things they do is interpreting the Constitution and checking the legislature and the executive from instituting any law or any executive order that would violate the Constitution. They stop them from doing that. All right? Okay? The executive can check the power of the legislature with his veto. Okay? They can say, no, it's not going to work. I'm vetoing that law. Forget it. Now, Congress has the power to go back and vote on it again. And they have what they call a veto-proof majority. So if you get enough people, Congress can check the executive. Congress can also check the executive with the power of impeachment. If they believe the executive has committed a crime, they can be impeached. Impeached just means you're put on trial. It doesn't mean you're kicked out. Okay, so President Trump was impeached. He was accused of committing an offense, basically offering someone something for favor, which isn't allowed, or something, it's a long word, it's called the Emoluments Clause. And you're not allowed to give the president something in exchange for his favor. That's against the law, but Congress voted no, that he was not convicted of that. Okay? A lot of that's very political, it has to do with how many friends do you have in Congress. So in some ways it's good to be friendly with the Congress. Yes, sir?
The Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate, is that an equal power in the legislative branch of like choosing and making the laws? How does that work?
They actually, the two branches of Congress check each other. Because any law has to then be approved by the other side. That's why they have something called a conference committee, because the House might make a law and the Senate makes a law and they're kind of the same but not quite. Then a conference committee meets together to kind of, hammer it all out so that they match perfectly. But both sides must agree. Okay? And then the president has to sign it. That's the process of passing legislation. Congress and Senate, or the House and the Senate, yes, we agree. We both pass a bill. The bills come together as one, goes to the president's desk. The president either signs it or vetoes it. The president can also has the right to send it back to Congress and say you need to make these changes before I'll sign it. That's another power that he has. Then that law comes over here. If someone challenges it, they go to the Supreme Court and they say, we don't think this law is allowed under the Constitution. They decide, yay or nay. Okay? They're doing a lot of deciding the past couple of weeks over crazy things about the election. A lot of that, they keep getting cases that are kind of unprecedented. ever before, because we have a president who's kind of unprecedented, no one like anyone ever before. So, I just want to mention, because it's in the public eye right now, on the 14th of this month, an important group meets together to make a crucial decision for our country. Anyone know what group that might be that meets next week?
The electors?
The electors. It's called the Electoral College. Remember, what does college mean? College mean back in colonial times? It's not a place you go to school.
Like a congregation?
It's a meeting. It's like a congress and a college mean the same thing. It means you're coming together to meet. So these people called electors are going to gather together in their states and they're going to vote. Their job is to vote. Their vote represents so many votes in their state. Okay? Almost every state, it's a winner-take-all deal. You get all the electors for that state. Now, as the election currently stands, the Electoral College will meet together. They will not meet together. They will meet in their states, and in each state they will cast their electoral vote. And when those votes are all added up in the whole country, Joseph R. Biden Jr. will become our next president. Our current president, President Donald J. Trump, is trying very hard to overturn that in ways that no one has ever done before in the history of our country. And the Supreme Court has already told him no. So what basically they brought a case before the court which has 3 judges who were appointed by President Trump. They returned basically a one-sentence decision, and then the final thing it just said denied. They weren't even going to hear the case, and there was no dissent. Usually, when someone disagrees, they write a dissenting opinion. There was no dissent. So apparently, and the Supreme Court meets in secret, so we don't know exactly what's said at any given time. But apparently, even the 3 judges he appointed didn't support his appeal to the Supreme Court to overturn all the results of the election was what he wanted to have happen. So apparently the last best try is I can't remember the senator representative right now, but a guy from the state of Texas has filed a lawsuit that says in every state that was contested, all of those should be overturned. And their electoral vote should be given to Trump instead of to Biden. Okay? So, no decision is made on that yet, but that's what's happening. That's kind of probably the last best try before the electors meet on the 14th. Okay? So when the electors meet, if everything goes according to constitutional plans, they'll vote, and that will be the final result of the presidential election. When the electors vote, the election isn't over until they cast their votes. They are the ones who decide. They represent you. If you will, not you guys, because you're not 18 yet. But when are you 18 yet? Almost. Next election, you'll get your turn. So anyone who voted, they represent those people. That's their job. Every now and then you get someone who decides they're not going to vote the way their state voted. They're called a faithless elector. It's very, very rare. And the Supreme Court recently said that the states can actually sue, or can penalize rather, can have some kind of penalty for a faithless elector. So that was a new thing that was added recently. So that's the way they set up our Constitution. All right? Let's see. Where was I? Okay, so now they have this document. It's this masterpiece of compromise. The big states have the clout in the House of Representatives. The small states have the clout in the Senate. Balance it all out so the small states don't get bullied by all the big states because they have more people. They never really came up with a good decision about slavery. The very weird decision that they came up with in representation is that the southern states could count slaves in their population total as 3/5 of a person, which is kind of crummy to say any human being is only 3/5 of a person, but that was the compromise that they made so that the South would get more representation. Okay, so like I said, we talked about the balance of the three systems, and Benjamin Franklin, I didn't tell you at the beginning, everything was very secret. All the doors were locked. They had armed guards at the doors, so nobody would know. They didn't want any outside pressure. They wanted to be able to work this all out without a lot of pressure from the outside. And the funny thing was, they actually assigned Benjamin Franklin a chaperone. He's 81 years old at this time, which is really, really old in colonial times. And he's very talkative. He talks all the time. And they don't want him going out in public and spilling what they're talking about. So he always has a chaperone with him wherever he goes. Now they have this blueprint of how to run a country, how to run a republic, a representative democracy, something that nobody has really much tried to do this way since Rome. Like ancient Rome, the Roman Empire, they had a democracy before they were the empire, but it didn't work. It failed. It became the empire under an emperor. Okay, so it changed. And a lot of people were very concerned that what if the president becomes like a king? People didn't want that. There was a big dispute about what are we going to call the president. And John Adams got into it with all kinds of names. His eminence, his great superiority, all of these names. And everyone's like, you're trying to make him into a king. And so somebody said, hey, why don't we just ask George Washington, because we know he's going to be the president, what does he want to be called? And he said, I just want to be called Mr. President. And so we still call our president Mr. President. He's just a citizen of America that has taken on the job of the chief executive officer of the country. Okay, so now we have this Constitution written. We need to sell it. We got to convince all the states to vote for it. That's called ratifying. Write it down. Ratifying means that they're going to vote for it. Each state has to pass it before it can be the legal document of the entire nation. It took 3 days in the Constitutional Convention to agree on the document, but they said, we don't want to do it ourselves. We don't want it to just be us. We want every state to buy in. We want every state to ratify this and say they will abide by it. So they sent it out to the states for ratification. Each state was to elect delegates to represent them and consider this proposed constitution. And if enough states approved it, it would become the law of the land. Obviously, we know it did. It did get approved. It was a little bit of a gamble to send it to the states, because if Virginia or New York or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, the big states, if any one of them voted it down, that would make it very difficult. If those states said, we're going our own way, we're not following the Constitution. Yes, sir?
How much time had passed, like between them, the Articles of Confederation being set in stone to this happening?
Okay, so the Articles of Confederation went all through the war, okay, and then this is after the war, okay, the war has ended in 1780, and 1787 is when they actually gathered together in Philadelphia. They've been talking about it, they've been, kind of working the back channels, and they meet in Philadelphia in 1787. So it's been a while, right? And they know that the states are bickering with each other. And they know that some of the states are trying to engage in foreign diplomacy, which they don't really want that to happen. The founders don't really want that to happen. So, like I said, it's a little bit of a gamble, and some people didn't like the idea of there being a central government. They thought it's fine to just have the states. And the idea of letting ordinary people decide was a little nerve-wracking, although in reality, only about 1/4 of the population actually has the right to vote. You have to be a man, you have to be white, and you have to be American, and you have to own property. So, no women, no poor people, no slaves, none of them are voting. Okay? And obviously you have to be an adult. You can't be a kid. And so, would enough of the quarter of the population agree? Would they go along with it? And every state had some spirited debate about it. And the one thing that we've talked a little bit about, because we've talked about Alexander Hamilton, was the Federalist Papers. Which probably you'll read at least one next week in your homework, or at least have a video about it. Who knows who wrote the Federalist Papers? Anybody? Some people we've just been talking about. Madison? Hamilton? Little Alexander Hamilton, always in there doing something. And another guy from Virginia named John Jay. They wrote these essays that were published as newspaper articles all over the country at the time, but they were anonymous. They didn't sign their names to them. The whole goal of the Federalist Papers was to convince America that federal government was important. Okay? Yes?
I just want to say, when I was doing research for the Founding Father, I chose John Jay, and I was reading about this, and originally there's 5 people
Right.
assigned to this, and Henry Lawrence from the book The Indigo Girl was one of them, but he backed out for some reason.
Yeah, he also died.
Uh,
Yeah. Henry Lawrence, yes, he was an interesting guy. So, okay, so these Federalist Papers are published all over the country to convince people that a strong central government is necessary. A strong federal government is what we need. You should be taking notes. Y'all taking notes? Okay, I should see pencils moving and that sort of thing. All right, so, it was passed. Enough states passed it, and so it was passed. And guess who was elected the first president?
James Madison?
No. Who's elected the first of everything?
George Washington.
George Washington. He is the first president. You guys didn't know George Washington was the first president of the United States? You haven't known that since kindergarten? You need to talk to your parents. All right. Washington was not the greatest politician. He was the greatest general, but not the greatest politician necessarily. But he did know, this is kind of a funny story, that if he gave some gifts to some of his voters, things like 47 gallons of beer, 35 gallons of wine, and 3 barrels of rum for voters for his first campaign in the Virginia legislature, that won over a lot of people. Of course, you can't do that anymore. There are laws against that now. He wasn't a good public speaker. He was very uncomfortable speaking in public. And he really didn't have new ideas. That wasn't his thing. He wasn't a Hamilton or a Madison who came up. But he was perfect for the new country to be their first president. He was extremely, extremely popular. Right? Even people who didn't like his politics, he was still popular with them. Okay? Other leaders knew that they should defer to him. Okay? So even though some of them didn't like him, like John Adams wasn't really fond of him, neither was Alexander Hamilton, and of course Adams and Hamilton weren't really fond of each other either. Lots of personalities, right? But he knew how to get competent people working for him. He knew how to get them to play to their strengths while ignoring their faults. So he knew that kind of things. And so his first group of people was a pretty amazing group of people. Anybody know who the vice president was? Mr. Adams. Ron Adams was his vice president. The Secretary of the Treasury, the Treasurer. Anybody know who that might be? A man who was good with money. Alexander Hamilton. And these two didn't like each other one bit. Adams and Hamilton. Adams was a little bit, because of where he's from in Massachusetts, where everybody's a little kind of uptight and proper, didn't approve of the fact that Hamilton was not an American and that his parents were not married. So Adams kind of looked down on Hamilton and thought of him as kind of a lightweight. Yes?
Wasn't Adams also like really outspoken, and didn't other people like Thomas Jefferson see him as like unclassy?
Yeah, well, yeah, and Adams just had a big mouth. He just would speak his mind, which is one of the reasons that back before all of this, they asked Thomas Jefferson, it was actually John Adams, who asked Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence, which was a lot of Adams' ideas. But he knew, first of all, that Jefferson was a better writer than he was, and Jefferson was popular, and Adams was not popular. People thought he was pretty annoying. So, you know, sometimes those New Englanders, they can be like that. So, and the other guy that doesn't get along with Hamilton is Jefferson. Opposites in many, many ways, right? No good family, from a very prominent Virginia planting family, very wealthy family, very prestigious family. Another funny thing was Hamilton was a short guy, but always impeccably groomed, impeccably dressed. He was never seen in public not just looking perfect. Whereas Jefferson was quite tall, but walked around looking like he just rolled out of bed. He was always in wrinkled clothes, and he didn't really care. And of course, he didn't have an actual wife. He just had his kind of, sort of slave wife. So he didn't really have a woman telling him what to do and how to dress. So they were very opposite. But the big thing they were opposite on was Hamilton saw a wealthy country based on banking and manufacturing. He had this vision for America, okay? Jefferson's like, no. We're all just going to own land, and we're going to be farmers, and we're going to live the country life, the rural life. You know, it's like, we don't need manufacturing. We'll just be fine with, you know, the way we have it now, where all the rich guys, they're not manufacturers, they are farmers. They're planters, as we call them in Virginia, own large places like Mount Vernon and Monticello and Montpelier, right? That's the life. And Hamilton is like, you have no idea what's coming. And Hamilton, of course, was right. Most of us do not live on large farms and grow our own crops. That's not the way we live. We live based on manufacturing, right? You know, look around this room. What in this room was not produced by manufacturing at some point? I mean, everything from the walls to the carpets, the tables, the chairs, the clothes you're wearing, everything, all produced in a manufacturing society. So Hamilton had it right. He knew what was coming, but they didn't like each other at all, okay? And Adams actually felt very out of place in the original cabinet with George Washington, because here's a fact, y'all. In the Constitution, the vice president has one job. You know what his job is? To wait around and replace the president if he gets sick or dies. That's his whole job. The Constitution does not give the vice president any specific duties. He is just there to take over if something happens to the president. He has no job. So it's a hard job. I just finished watching a documentary that was done that was called President in Waiting. And it was basically all of the vice presidents from the 20th and 21st century, just talking about how they made this job work. And in some cases, the president never even consulted the vice president, didn't let him in his cabinet meetings, didn't have anything to do with him. And later on, as we come towards modern times, presidents started including vice presidents in their cabinet meetings and in decision making, because ultimately, if something happens to the president, the vice president needs to take over. He kind of needs to go know what's going on in the world, right? Because if he has to suddenly step up. So here's an example. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt was the president during World War II, right? And they're planning to drop 2 nuclear weapons. Well, they're planning to drop 1 and hopefully not 2, but the Japanese didn't surrender after the first one, so they had to drop 2. His vice president, Harry Truman, didn't even know about that plan. So Roosevelt dies and Truman is the president, and this plan, they have to go like brief him really quick on this is what's happening in the world that you had no idea about. So since the middle of the 20th century, vice presidents are generally more consulted, more involved in what's going on, and presidents try to make sure that they have business to take care of, that they delegate things to them. All right. So when we look at, let's go look at Hamilton and Jefferson for a minute. These 2 guys basically led us to our first 2 political parties. Okay? Hamilton is a Federalist. I forget what the party of Jefferson was originally called. It's a funny name. No. It's like the Democratic Republicans. I think it is. Yes, they were called the Democratic Republicans. I'll be writing it down. So, the Federalists, strong central government. Democratic Republicans, more hands-off, more power to the states. The Federalists favor business and banking because they want the country to grow and become more affluent. These guys do not favor banking or business. All right? We can't really say, oh, they're like the Democrats today and they're like the Republicans today, because it was very mixed up. Okay? Because it's Republicans nowadays that are supporters of business and small government, and it's Democrats that are more interested in people issues and having a large government that is helping people, involved in people's lives more. So it doesn't quite match up that way. Let's see. Okay, good. Still have a little bit of time. So, where was I? Oh, the Democratic Republicans, they favored the French, while the Federalists favored the British as far as foreign policy was concerned. Like I said, the Democratic Republicans were not about business. They were not about supporting manufacturing, while the Federalists were. These differing visions of Hamilton and Jefferson about the country we see kind of in that. But this is the beginning of our 2-party system. And this year, if you pay attention to the news, you've heard a lot about why do we have a 2-party system? Why don't we have any other viable choices? What if I don't want Trump and I don't want Biden? Why don't I have a choice? Well, you do. You can vote for anybody you want. You can write your own name in if you're 18 years old. Of course, you're only voting if you're 18 years old. You can vote for anybody. But unless a whole lot of other people are voting for that anybody, that's not going to make any impact. Your vote is basically a protest vote, which is fine. Some people choose not to vote. It's called abstaining. I just choose not to vote. I don't like the choices. I'm not voting. Yes?
So theoretically, you could just vote for anybody? And
Yes.
is that-
You can
is
write
that-
them in. It's called a write-in vote.
Okay, so if a lot of people voted for that person, what would happen?
Well, if
Okay.
enough of them voted for them, they could potentially win. But you go state by state. Remember, you have to win the big states. There's actually kind of a science to campaigning. Because you know, the Democrats are always going to win California and New York, the way it currently is. Right, so that's a big chunk of votes right there. Okay, so the Republican candidate has to pay attention to adding up other states that are more Republican, that are more business focused, that are more conservative, usually. All right? And so there's like people that work for these presidential campaigns that balance all that out and say you need to go campaign here and you need to go campaign here because we need those votes. People say one of the reasons that Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump was she ignored the last 2 weeks of the campaign what's called the Rust Belt, which is the upper Midwest, places like Michigan, Wisconsin, where it used to be there was lots and lots of manufacturing. That's why they call it, like rust, like iron, right? And all the plants closed, and now they're all rusting. Why did the plants close? Because it's cheaper to make stuff overseas. They were in Mexico. All the jobs went away. So all these people in the 40s and 50s, after World War II, that grew up, and they would go work in the plant, like their dad did. And they would work their whole life in an automotive plant or a steel plant, and then they'd retire and they'd have a great pension. And that was the lifestyle until that started to change and more manufacturing went overseas because it's cheaper. How many of you go to Walmart and buy an $8 t-shirt? If that t-shirt costs $28, are you going to buy it? If it's made by American labor, because we pay people a lot more than we pay in China or Mexico, where you might make 10 cents an hour, or in Mexico maybe 20 cents an hour, you can make cheap stuff, okay? I can probably guarantee every single one of you is probably wearing at least one item of clothing or carrying something made in China. Because we like cheap stuff. That's just how America, I mean, most people like cheap stuff, right? But we don't want to spend a lot of money. That's why the garment industry used to be in this country. We had a huge garment industry where all the clothes were made in America. All overseas, not in this country anymore. All of those are closed down now. They're empty. So that's how America changed in that way. And then, so we get to 1796. Washington has served 2 terms as president. He's done. He's not going to be the father of our country anymore. He wants to go home. He wants to go back to Virginia, go back to Mount Vernon, and live on his beautiful plantation with his wife and family. He actually died not that long after going back. Kind of sad. But he set a precedent for our country that a president serves 2 terms. And that would stay that way until Franklin Roosevelt, who served 4 terms, and then we changed the law. You can only serve 2 terms in a row. Okay? I just want to tell you about one other person, one really interesting person. While other people are working with governments and political parties, this guy was doing something else. He was creating a specifically American language. His name is Noah Webster. You probably heard of Webster's Dictionary. That's not exactly where Webster started, though. He actually started, he was a school teacher, and he realized that people in America needed a common language because they came from different places, and they spoke very differently depending on where in Europe they had come from. And so he created a grammar book, a reading book, and a spelling book. That spelling book became a bestseller for decades and actually standardized spelling of most words in America. Spelling was very random for a long time. You read old documents, colonial documents, and some of the spelling is crazy. You're like, what? That's not how that's spelled. It was Noah Webster that standardized spelling in America. And we think of him as the dictionary, right? The dictionary guy. And he did do that. He did produce dictionaries, and he included in his dictionaries 12,000 words and 30,000 definitions that had never been in an English language dictionary before. They were specifically Americanisms, things that American people said. And Webster wrote, this is the last thing we're going to talk about today, America must be as independent in literature as she is in politics, as famous for her arts as she is for her armies. And that's what he did. He gave America a specific language and its own literature that we call American literature. All right, go have lunch. Everybody got a homework paper? All right, see you on video on Tuesday.